The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're here for the GLWQA seminar series, and I'm going to introduce Mark Rowe, who is going to introduce our speaker, Dr. James Pauer.
Good morning, everyone. We're pleased to have James Pauer as our speaker today. James is an environmental engineer with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency at the Large Lakes Research Station in Grosse Ile, Michigan, where I did a postdoc for 2 years before starting here at GLWQA. James works on water quality modeling. He's lead author on 2 papers applying the LM3 Eutro model to simulate the influence of phosphorus loads on the trophic state of Lake Michigan. More recently, he's worked on modeling the influence of nutrient loads on hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. James originally hails from South Africa, and he's a fellow Husky, having earned his PhD at Michigan Technological University in 1996, working with Marty Auer on the kinetics of nitrification in lakes and rivers. So thanks for coming today, James, and I'll let you introduce your talk.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to present some of our research that we are doing at Grosse Ile at the EPA station there. Before I start, I want to acknowledge some other people working on the project. Xiaomi Zhang, who's actually in the audience today, Wilson Melendez, Ras Kreis, and Dave Griesmer. And like I said, we all work at the EPA station in Grosse Ile, Michigan. An outline of my talk, I'm going to talk about why do we care about the near shore? What exactly is the near shore? What have been done to quantify the near shore? What could I found historically? And then I'm going to summarize and analyze some of this earlier work. I'm going to show some of our work that we're doing now and try to summarize what we learned so far and what's next. So why do we care about the near shore? Well, it seems that the offshore waters of the Great Lakes is in pretty good shape, but that is not the case for the near shore. In the past, people have had issues with eutrophication, problems with Cladofra, invasive mussels, and of course the big thing these days, the harmful algae blooms. Now, it seems like Lake Erie is getting all the attention for the reason, and I know that a lot of people in this room actually is working on Lake Erie. Like Michigan is not as bad as Lake Erie, but even Lake Erie have some problems in the near shore. So this is from the latest update of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, where the governments of Canada and the United States recognizing that the nearshore areas must be restored and protected because they are a major source of drinking water for communities within the basin and where most human commerce and recreation occurs, and are the critical link, ecological link between the watershed and the open waters of the Great Lakes. So it is a big deal for people in the Great Lakes area. It's a big deal for the US EPA. The other issue is that we want to see how does the nearshore respond with changes in the watershed and also changes in the climate. So what exactly is the nearshore? And I've looked at a lot of papers and I've talked to a lot of people, and I don't think people still have consensus. Anyway, at least it includes, bays, harbors, coastal wetlands, river mouths, and then of course the shallow areas of the lakes. And I think the shallow areas is one of the topics that people are still in disagreement with, and I would like to hear people's opinion about that. Is Green Bay or Saginaw Bay part of the nearshore? What about Western Lake Erie? In some sense, it is a small, shallow basin. This graph just shows you Lake Michigan, and it shows you, if you can see, the nearshore areas in this reddish orange in color. And you can see if 20 meters is the criteria, it includes Green Bay and several of the little bays and islands and so on. So what has been done in terms of nearshore? And like I say, it depends on how we define the nearshore. Little or lots. If we include the bays like Green Bay, Saginaw Bay, people have studied these bays quite a bit. If we talk about the nearshore in terms of the shallow areas of the lake, actually very little has done, and over the past many years people were more concerned about the open waters, and most of the sampling was happening in the open waters. However, I did find a number of good papers of the nearshore, and here I'm not just going to talk about Lake Michigan. I'm going to talk about the Great Lakes in general. So I'm not going to talk about any of the bays like Green Bay, and I'm not going to talk about Western Lake Erie. I found one very good study by Makarovich, that he did work on Lake Ontario. And he made a couple of statements, and the first one sounds pretty obvious, but I think it's very important. He defines the nearshore as the transition zone between the shoreline and the open waters. And I think the big issue here is the fact that it's a transition zone. It is not uniform. And then he defines the shoreline as small bays, harbors, rivers, river confluences, coastal wetlands, rivers, shoreside waters, and then shallow and deeper waters. And in his paper, he showed this this table. And this is a very interesting table. He basically showed the TP concentration and the chlorophyll A concentration for these different categories. And what you can see from this graph is that the top three, the shore side, which is the very shallow waters, the rivers and the embayments, has very high total phosphorus, and with the exception of the rivers, very high chlorophyll A. The reason why the river is probably a little lower in chlorophyll A is because of probably being pretty turbid. But if you compare that with the 30 meter and the 100 meter offshore station, you can see there is a huge disconnect. There's a huge difference. Now, what's also interesting from this graph is that the 30 meter and the 100 meter is not that much different. It almost seems that the 30 meter contour, relatively closely resemble the offshore waters for both total phosphorus and chlorophyll A. This is from a paper by Peter Uresta who works at EPA in Duluth. I think this paper was published, 2014, where he did some analysis of work that was done as part of the National Coastal Condition Assessment and also the 2010 Lake Michigan CSMI, and I think some other work too. And what this graph show is quite a few things. The one is there is this general trend that I think it's going to be easier for me to use this. This is the 30-meter depth contour, and what you can see is that in this area, if you can call it the near shore, let's look at total phosphorus. Total phosphorus is particularly high, very close to the shore, but then it tails off very quickly, and around 10, 15, 20 meters, it started looking a lot like the offshore waters. And I think this general trend is true for all of these variables. The same for specific conductance and also chlorophyll A. There's from one very high point, but then it goes down, and this looks a lot like the offshore. This was a table from Pothoven and Vanenstiel, even though the study was about zooplankton, but I found this in the paper, and this was, very interesting because it gives us sort of a bit of a seasonal component, where not only did they look, spatially at the concentration of chlorophyll A, but they also looked at it seasonally. And once again, a few things. In spring and early summer, you can see that chlorophyll A is quite a bit higher than in late summer and fall. And this is for the 50-meter station. If you compare, this with the rest of the chlorophyll, you can see everything is pretty low, and quite frankly, there's not a huge difference between the 45-meter station and the offshore station, but there's quite a difference between, especially the spring and early summer chlorophyll A concentration versus the rest. Even in late summer and fall, the difference between the 50-meter station is not as dramatic between the offshore station and a station much closer to the shore. This was work that was done also by Peter Jurista and his group, where they went and they sampled Lake Michigan, and they had their towing device, and they start in the northern part of I guess this is probably Michigan or Wisconsin. Anyway, northern Michigan, and they went down on the 20-meter contour, and they continuously measured a number of variables, including temperature, specific conductivity, and phytoplankton, even though it's actually fluorescence. And they they average this, and what you can see is that I think the point they want to make is that there is definitely a signal between the watershed and the near shore, and what you can see is even if you look at something like chlorophyll A, there is some variation on the 20-meter contour, starting on the Wisconsin side and then go all the way to the northern Michigan side. It's even more dramatic for temperature. You can see there's a big dip in temperature, and of course, a lot of things play a role in that. I also looked in satellite imagery and see how that can, assist me, guide me, help me with the near shore. But so far I really haven't found, stuff that was particularly useful to me. I mean, granted, I have not looked this hard, and also I am no expert with this. So what have I concluded from these studies? The one thing, and I think this is important, that most of these studies, if not all of these studies, are a snapshot of the nearshore at a specific location at a specific time. Some people have done a little seasonal stuff, some people have done a little spatial stuff, but for the most part, this is a snapshot, and usually these snapshots are taken in summer when it's nice outside. The second conclusion is that the 0 to 20 meter depth is a heterogeneous transition zone and is likely affected by the season as well. And the third one is that the 0 to 5 meters area can be strongly affected by river inputs. Well, it is, or it can be very different from the open waters. But the question is this the nearshore? So I found this interesting quote from a paper that was published by Peter Urista on Lake Huron. And I really like this, what he said. He said, although identifying local input points and plume dynamics is an important part of research into coastal processes, this may be of less importance for assessing a general nearshore condition. Missing a small tributary plume on a contour will not greatly change the representation of the great spatial nearshore region, even though it may not capture an anomaly within a specific plume. And I think this is the issue, is like, do we care about that little plume? Do we care about the bigger area? So, we've just started doing some work on this, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about our preliminary analysis. The one thing is that I got some field data that was measured in 2003 of the Muskegon and the Grand Rivers, and I'm going to talk just very briefly about what we're trying to do with some of our modeling work. Now, this is a graph that we showed probably at some conference or something many years back. But the point I want to make here is just two things. The one is that if you look at Lake Michigan, and this is like lake-wide, mainly offshore concentrations, neither the concentration in the lake has changed much over the last number of years. And if you look at the loadings, this is the loadings from Dave Dolan, you can see that the TP loadings have been up and down, but really not much has changed in the loadings in the last few years. Granted, it only goes until 2008. This is also a graph based on loadings from Dave Dolan. And if you look at Lake Michigan, obviously, I'll try this. You have the Fox River, which is a major player in terms of phosphorus, but it's a major player in terms of phosphorus, but it discharges into Green Bay. But the major players in terms of phosphorus, especially on the eastern side of Lake Michigan, is the Grand, the St. Joe, the Kalamazoo, and to some lesser extent the Muskegon. So this graph just showed, the red thumb tags is work that was done as part of the 2010 National Coastal Condition Assessment. if I zoom in a little bit, the green and the yellow thumb tags are samples that was taken, it was transects of the Muskegon and the Grand Rivers. And if I zoom in a little bit more, this is transects, and the transect that was done, they call it like a transect, a river transect, a southern, a northern of the Grand River, and the same southern, a lake, and a northern transect of the Muskegon River, and then in each case they had an offshore station. And what they try to do is to sample, at 20 meters, at 10 meters, 20 meters, and 30 meters, pretty much for all three transects. So looking at the results, and this is very interesting, and there was a few surprises here. The one is that if you look at the bottom, this is the river concentration. This is just for the Grand. This is the Grand River chlorophyll A concentration. And when I saw that number, I was a little shocked and surprised. That looked to me rather high. I was expecting something more like maybe 40 or 60, but not 110 almost. And I tried to find some historical data for the Grand, but I wasn't able. But what was interesting is I found some chlorophyll A data in Muskegon Lake. Now, granted, this is Muskegon Lake. This is not, exactly, but it was interesting to. What you can see is that for the most part, the concentrations are, I don't know what you can say, 30 or 40, but then it spikes up very high, and then in August, you can see it's quite different. Actually, if you go back, these samples were taken in late July. Now, the other interesting thing about this data, and like I say, the bottom two are the tributary transect. So it's basically this transect. If you look at, I did it in terms of depth, and I also did it in terms of distance from the shore. And what you can see is if you look at especially the green dot and the red dot, you can see that within 10 meters that chlorophyll A and the TP are diluted very significantly. And then beyond this, perhaps it goes down a little bit, but not much. And I think this general trend, it was true for all the transects. The one maybe close to 10 meters, you can still see it's got some influence by the river, and then beyond this, it is really not that much different. Now, this graph showed just the Grand River monthly flow for 2003, and this is not surprising at all. The high flows is in the spring and early summer, and the low flows is later in the summer and early fall. And we all know that there's a pretty good correlation between phosphorus and river flows. I tried to find some loading data for the Grand. I was not particularly successful. This plot was this was part of the Lake Michigan Mass Balance project, and I think that these measurements, these loadings, was done by the USGS. And it doesn't have that exactly the shape that I was expecting, but it does have. In spring you get the high loads, and then it goes down in summer. 95 was a little different. So what I try to do is that I'm trying to see if I can, develop some simple model that can basically represent this data. The grid I actually got from people here at Lurel, and I, as well as the hydrodynamics. So what we did is that we developed a little model, and at this stage, this is still early stages, we are just playing with tracer. So what we're trying to do is that, see what happens if we put in a tracer at approximately the Grand River river mouth, and run it for X number of days. In this case, I'm just showing at day 30, and as expected, the tracer gets diluted very quickly, and it sticks pretty much close to the shore. Without showing an animation, actually it goes up and down a little bit, so it does get smeared a little bit along the shore. So once we have this model a little bit further developed, we are going to try to see if we can simulate, a conservative and perhaps ultimately a nutrient. So what have we learned so far, and what's next? I think I've said this before, but the watershed signal from the river gets diluted very quickly, and this is not surprising. The other thing is that the 20-meter contour is really, if it's near shore, is really on the edge of the near shore. Even though Peter Jurista did show that there is definitely a link between the watershed and the 20-meter concentration of whatever. And then we think that that the near shore, including the 20-meter, is likely strongly affected by the season, and it should be higher in spring than it should be in other months. But I'm still unclear where to sample, and I think this is going to be a big part of this work that we're working on. So I think what we want to accomplish with this work is to go beyond a snapshot and trying to describe the near shore, for a month, for a season, for a year, so that we can, instead of saying this is what's happening in July or this is what's happening in April, if we can say something more general, this is what's happening in the near shore. Yeah, my next point is just that the tracer, at this stage, early stage of the model, just shows that, the signal gets diluted very quickly. I like this slide because, here you can see this is the Grand River. This is the 20-meter contour. And the question is this the near shore? Is the plume the near shore? And how does this change with time and space? So, what are we going to do in the future? As part of the Lake Michigan CSMI, which, a lot of stuff is happening this spring and fall, and this spring and summer and fall, the US EPA, in collaboration with NOAA, USGS, and other partners, will collect samples around the major Michigan rivers. We plan to sample the Grand, the St. Joe, the Muskegon, and the Kalamazoo. We plan to collect samples in May, July, and September. In fact, the first cruise is going out, I think, in a week or two. And at minimum, we're going to measure TP, chloride, and chlorophyll A, and hopefully a number of other water quality variables. Then we're going to start simple and see, can we model chloride? And if we're successful, then we're going to go beyond this and see, can we model, nutrients, phytoplankton. If we're successful, what we hope is that we can apply this to learn something about, how dynamic the system is, and perhaps we can, get some wisdom in terms of how does changes in, the climate or loadings or landscape impact the nearshore. And perhaps that this insight we can gain is something that we can learn as to the big issue that we're still trying to figure out is where to sample the nearshore if we want to develop a nearshore, entire nearshore strategy for Lake Michigan or the Great Lakes. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I'd like to open the floor up to questions if anyone has any. I'll bring the microphone over to you.
I'm curious about, you were saying this seasonal look at the nearshore and at the same time trying to get a definition of nearshore. I tend to think of that as the nearshore is something that fulfills one of these properties, either a distance or a depth. Somewhat working from that, it's the area where humans interact with the lakes most. And if there's very steep drop-off, then they still might go out a mile. Whereas if there's a very shallow drop-off, going out a mile, there may not even, it may still have to be in a channel. But you were raising some interesting questions about, because of the dynamics of the system, something might be essentially offshore water in one season and nearshore water in another season. So are you seeing that even the boundary changing through time, or focusing more on the nearshore as this heterogeneous area where even if something's offshore water at this time, it'd still be part of the nearshore area because it's sometimes nearshore water?
That's a loaded question. And I don't have the answer. I mean, the issue is that when I start looking at this and people talk about the 20 meter as being the nearshore, it sounded great. It's fairly easy to quantify. But then, when I go and I look at this slide, this is kind of a revealing slide in many ways. This is a Google Maps slide, and you can see, at this time of year, and I don't know when it was done, you can see the movement of the water. So, and this is this might be in spring, it might be in fall, I don't know, but the issue is that, and this is that quote, is that where people interact with the water is probably not 20 meters, maybe there's a few pipes for drinking water, but it's more 5 meters, 10 meters. But sometimes if you go and you take a sample there, you're going to get mainly Grand River water. If you take a sample there, it might be so diluted it'll be 90% Lake Michigan water. So I'm still struggling, what I want to conclude from this, and I think this is where we're going to go out and we're going to take samples very close to the we can do some transects there and there, 5 meters, 10 meters, to see what changes, and we're going to do it in May, hopefully. The flows are high, we're going to do it in summer, the flows are low, and in September I do not know. So I don't know.
Yeah, hi. I can't really answer the questions, but we have, that looks like the 2 kilometer grid. Is that the grid you're going to do your modeling on as you go forward? Or are you using the hydrodynamics from us that are on that grid and going forward with your modeling?
This was like what I presented here was like, we had some data, we want to see what happened, and we tried to get some insight before we go sample this summer. I don't know. The problem with the 2K grid is that, does it really represent the nearshore? Right. If the nearshore is the 20 meter line, then the 2K grid is great.
Well, that's what I was going to offer. We have a nested grid. I don't know if you've seen that, which is, I think, either 100 meter or at most 200 meter. So that we run for that area, the Grand River plume area. So we have that grid and those hydrodynamics, and that's running. It's probably been running 7, 8 years, and it's running real time now. So if that would be of use, we have a very fine grid. It's still structured, but much finer than a 2 kilometer, and that might help the hydrodynamics and moving stuff around. And we also have flyover images of the plumes that we specifically did one summer to try to, we also model that area, and we put in simulator tracers and particles, and then we use the flyovers of with the pilot photography, and trying to do similar stuff. But we also have a real big database of those flyovers from a few years back. If those would also be of use to you,
very useful. To
look at literally like you say, the swash back and forth, sometimes offshore, how tightly it hugs, and especially when you couple that with a real fine model grid, that might help you guys a little bit if you're interested.
So when you did this, did you get any insights as to any general trend statements?
Well, we couldn't obviously look at seasonal stuff or look at year to year. It was just one point in time, maybe 3, 4, 5 days. But we did, and we were trying to use that as ground truthing to look at our model results and our particles and dye. And yeah, it did match quite well when the winds shifted, from the south or from the north. And we see that still to this day with the model. These particles would just hug the coast generally, and up and down depending on the wind and the currents, and occasionally go offshore again depending on the river flow and or the currents. So I don't know if we got much more insight than that, but we were able to trust our model a little bit based on some of those flyovers.
I will be very interesting, because the thing is that as part of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, what they want to do is that is there a place or places where we can sample to develop a sample design that we can go out every year, every 3 years, every 5 years, and see, we're observing changes in the nearshore, and and nobody really, as far as I know, have a good answer.
Yeah, I might comment. In addition to the stuff you mentioned, Pothoven and Fonensteel are working on, we do seasonal transects from 10 meters inshore to about 110 meters offshore using our plankton survey, which is much like Peter Urista's gadget. And it does vary with time, depending on river loading. It can, and the other thing that's nice about a system like that, vertical structure is very important in terms of chlorophyll and total phosphorus. As part of CSMI, we're going to be out there once a month working that transect day and night to get a vertical structure of chlorophyll, as well as zooplankton along those transects. And I think that'll be very helpful for development of models and defining sampling schemes and what constitutes the nearshore, which is very dynamic. The other thing that's important when you consider this is the bathymetry. If you go up north where you have very steep contours, the whole system is dominated by really offshore water. And so whether you get nearshore effects depends on the slope of your bathymetry as it affects exchange between nearshore and offshore.
No, I think that a model is great, but the field data is sort of I think this is what really guides people. But the issue is still people try to try to make some generalization about the nearshore, and that is and they have seen some differences, but that's where it gets tricky.
couple of questions from our webinar attendees. There's a question from Doug Pearsall that says, shouldn't we consider the nearshore definition to be flexible rather than a single depth? The influence of tributaries varies considerably with depth, currents, and coastal land use. We don't constrain coastal dunes to an arbitrary distance from shore, but use soil and landform to define these features. Seems nearshore could consider analogous attributes throughout the lake, through in the lake.
I only heard some of that question.
Okay. Shouldn't we consider the nearshore definition to be flexible rather than a single depth? The influence of tributaries varies considerably with depth, currents, and coastal land use. We don't constrain coastal dunes to an arbitrary distance from shore, but use soil and landform to define these features. Seems nearshore could consider analogous attributes, though in the lake.
Well, I mean, I agree in some sense that's true, but what we're trying to do is trying to see, where can we sample to represent the nearshore, and what is the, that sounds terrible, but what is the minimum number of samples we can take and still, observe a long-term trend of the nearshore, and maybe we should look at the, southeast part of Lake Michigan, it should be there. If you look at north part, it should be there. That might be true. I mean, it's like, I think going out with this CSMI, maybe we can learn something and we can all be a little bit better understanding what's going on in nearshore.
Question from a Barry Leish says, will you base your sampling this summer on distances from shore, regardless of depth, or depth, regardless of distance offshore? You mentioned 5, 10, 15, 20 meter depths. Is that the plan?
At this stage, we are thinking more depth than distance. At this stage, we're thinking about 5, 10, maybe 15, and perhaps 20. I know that 20 gets close to the general sampling that GLWQA is doing. So, but I would like to hear people's opinion about the distance as well, but we are thinking in terms of depth.
Great. Do we have any other questions? If not, that concludes our webinar seminar, and thank you all for joining us.
I hope the people online on the